All right, good evening, community, and welcome back to the Live Black Experience Community Dialogues. We are excited to be back for another year of community conversations about all things about the history of Black Flagstaff, the history of Black Americans, and just how we have shaped this nation and how we are still shaping this nation and the stories that we have to contribute to the legacy and the development of America. Tonight, we are going to be talking about the subject in pursuit of the Black vote. With this topic, we often hear how Black Americans have helped shape the outcome of the 2020 presidential election, but not only that, but that we've been integral to the votes in many of the past 20 years or more elections and been credited with saving the future of American democracy. Yet tonight, we are coming with the question, if the Black vote matters so much, why is it that we cannot pass the John Lewis Voting Rights Act? And tonight, we're going to have an overview of the history of the Black vote in the United States. We're going to look at its complicated history, both in the past, look at how it's complicated in our present, and look towards the future of the Black vote. And it's my honor this evening to reintroduce you to our speaker for tonight, who is, we call him Doctor. He is almost there, and we're just claiming it now, Dr. Donald Guillory, who is a doctoral candidate at the University of Mississippi, whose focus is on race, gender, and identity in the history of the United States and Latin America. A graduate of Georgia Southern University, he earned his Bachelor of Arts in International Studies and History, and Master of Arts in History. After serving in the United States Army, he attended Arizona State University, where he earned his master's degrees in education and liberal studies, focusing on the role that film and television play in shaping our perspectives about culture and gender. He is also the author of The Token Black Guide, which discusses and examines experiences and perspectives, historical and personal, on race in America. In February 2020, he presented a TEDx talk at the University of Mississippi entitled The Importance of the Narrative. He is the author of Bastards on the Bayou and Magnolia Lane, fictional works which blend history and horror. Additionally, he has served as the coordinator and guide for tours on the University of Mississippi campus, contextualizing the history of slavery. In the fall of 2021, he assumed the role of managing editor for the Sociology of Race and Ethnicity, an academic publication discussing and analyzing issues related to race and identity. Welcome, Dr. Guillory.
Thank you. And as you say that, I'm like, approaching that finish line. It's getting there. It's getting there. Pretty soon it will be official. But no, thank you. It's always a pleasure to take part in these discussions, to talk about history, especially overlooked history, and in some cases, history that unfortunately various political actors are trying to eliminate from curriculum, eliminate from the public dialogue, and pretend as though it did not exist or not even teach. I won't even single out children, won't teach our communities about the importance of the historical events that have helped shape this nation. And tonight, of course, I'm going to talk briefly, and I guess I should put quotation marks, but I'm going to speak briefly about the history of the Black vote and kind of where we are now with respect to that. So I prepared a little bit of a PowerPoint to get us through this. So, those of you who are viewing this on Facebook or on whatever feed you're looking at, don't worry, this is not death by PowerPoint. This is simply just to give a visual aid to help accompany this discussion to illustrate some points, no pun intended. So we'll be talking about Black voting in the U.S. and the history that's there. So again, this is just a general overview. So if you could hit the next slide for me, please. So this quote from Frederick Douglass after the end of the Civil War in 1866 is very important to think about. And I'll read it for brevity. But the arm of the federal government is long, but it is far too short to protect the rights of individuals in the interior of distant states. They must have the power to protect themselves, or they will go unprotected, in spite of all the laws the federal government can put upon the national statute book. Now, he's one talking about the expansion of federal authority, and of course the federal authority over state authority, which is the system that we work in. But we have some debate as to which one is going to be more important, or at least which one's more powerful. The federal government is set up to protect the rights of the individuals within the United States. And one of the violators of those rights, unfortunately, is often the states themselves. Now, this is something that you saw, from the foundations of this government. But since we're talking about the post-Civil War era, starting from Reconstruction till now, you're looking at the way in which voting rights have been expanded, but then also the way in which voting rights have been have receded as far as the people who are able to vote, how we're able to vote, where we're able to vote, and in some cases, who we're able to vote for. So one of the protections that Frederick Douglass is addressing, aside from the federal authority itself, is promoting programming and policy that the United States government can use in order to ensure that people's rights are not violated at the local, county, city, and state level. Next slide, please. And next slide as well, because I can get to the Civil Rights Act of the 1964 and 65. So the 14th Amendment, it does not come into play until 1868. Now, the 13th Amendment is ratified at the end of 1865, not fully ratified by every state until 2013. And there's no shocker as far as which state was the last one to do it. It was Mississippi, as far as ratifying it on their state constitution. But the 14th Amendment is set up to ensure that there is equal protection for citizens and people who reside within the borders of the United States. This is to make sure that no matter what, your rights are going to be protected the same as your neighbor, despite your race, your previous servitude, status of servitude, your national origin, your religion. This is to make sure that, one, any of the Confederates that had survived the war and were still in power or still fighting for power could not exert their power over other citizens in the sense of taking their rights away. Next slide, please. The reason for this is, if you're looking at the voter turnout within those first elections after the Civil War, you're looking at a majority Black voting bloc in a couple of states, South Carolina, Mississippi. Louisiana is roughly 50-50 as far as white and freedmen. And then other states, you see a substantial amount of people that are able to vote. Now, not all white citizens are going to vote the same way. Obviously, not all freedmen are going to vote the same way. The vast majority of the freedmen are supporting the Republican Party. The vast majority of the white citizens in the South are supporting the Democratic Party. But then you have a good number who are also supporting Republicans as well. Next slide, please. Those numbers, oh, sorry, next slide. Next one. Those numbers make people a little bit too concerned. And this is kind of a grainy picture. This is the best one I could find when I first made this presentation. And the fear is, by expanding the rights for freedmen, there is a narrative that's created which states they're getting more rights, and they're getting these rights at the expense of my rights as a white Southerner. These men, now I'm singling out men because Black women were not afforded the right to vote, as well as white women, except on the local level. In some states, some cities, women were allowed to vote, but nationally there was no protection. There was no guarantee for women to vote. The fear that comes out of this is, because you have such high numbers of Black voters, these Black voters are going to take it for granted. They haven't earned this right to vote. As a white man, as a white male, 21 years of age, who is a property owner, I have the right to vote based off of these qualifications. All these black people did, all these black men did, was have the government hand it to them. So it starts to create some animosity as to the political power that these black individuals have. And it starts to create a little bit of a rift. Next slide, please. Because the fear is, or at least the paranoia is, that this is going to be unfettered power, or at least the sense of power that the freedmen are now going to have, because they have the protection of the federal government and they have the oversight from the Freedmen's Bureau, which was set up to ensure that their rights were protected, that resources were handed out, that housing was secure, that jobs were going to be pushed for. Next slide, please. Next slide. So in that 1868 election, the numbers I gave you, you can see a vast amount of the electoral votes go towards Ulysses S. Grant. And he also gets the majority of the popular vote. However, he doesn't get it in some of the southern states. South Carolina, majority black. Mississippi, majority black. However, they have to hold on as far as having their votes recognized. Alabama, it's roughly 50-50. I think it was like 45-55. Louisiana was another strange situation where it's roughly 50-50, but Seymour is able to win out of Louisiana. But next slide, please. The thing that really puts Grant over is he is able to have a 500,000 African American vote differential that puts him over the top. You then throw this in as well. Because we're able to have African Americans, newly freed African Americans, first time they're able to vote in 1868, they're able to push the state over with respect to those votes, whether we're talking about South Carolina or whether we're talking about Virginia. I'm sorry, not Virginia, North Carolina. Whether we're talking about those states, this is now going to create a little bit more animosity, because people are going to see that these black voters are only voting for Grant because the Republicans gave protections to African Americans in the South, but also because of the Reconstruction governments that were put in place. So as a white male, whether you're a white male of means or if you're a white male who is a poor white farmer who is now able to vote, you don't see the equity in your vote. And the statement that we always like to look to is one person, one vote. This is the most basic way that we can see equality within the system, within the United States itself. Every person's vote counts as one. My vote is equal to my neighbor's vote. And now that our votes are equal, you are now saying politically, socially, we are equal. That is going to run counter to the narrative that a lot of Southern whites are being taught, which is to use W.D.B. Du Bois's statement, or his term, the psychological wages of whiteness, which as long as you are white, you are one step higher than any Negro. Now that we can vote on equal terms, I no longer have this higher status because you have the same political power as me. It is 1-to-1. It's no longer 1-to-0. It is 1-to-1. So during Grant's administration, the 15th Amendment gets passed. And actually, you can go to the next slide because it's just a duplicate. And as part of the 15th Amendment, it states the right of citizens of the United States to vote shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or by any state. Very important to put this here. By any state on account of race, color, or previous condition of servitude. There's nothing in here about gender, though. There's nothing that's going to guarantee that women can vote. So if you can skip 2 slides ahead to the colored rule. Thank you. So the fear now is, because they now not only have equal protection in the 14th Amendment, you now have the protection of your vote. The fear for a lot of Southern whites, whether they were poor white or whites with means, or wealthy whites for that matter, the fear is these new Negro legislators are going to lord over us. They are now going to be in control. So the system is going to basically be flipped on its head. We are now going to have to worry about, and this is coming from letters, coming from documents, we're now going to have to worry about being enslaved by them. So going from thinking about we are above them, we're a step ahead on this social and political scale, we're one step above. Now we're equal. The fear that comes after the 15th Amendment and with these Reconstruction governments, now that you have Black legislators that are elected, you have Pinchback that's elected in Louisiana. I'm sorry, he's appointed in Louisiana to be governor. You have Black senators, you have Black representatives. Now the fear is these men are above us. So everything has flipped. Where we were up, now they're up. The fear is what is going to now happen to our society since these guys are in charge. Next slide, please. The only way to counter this is through violence. It's through things like the Mississippi Black Codes, which come at the end of the Civil War. It is to ensure that Black men and women, for that matter, are kept in their place. You have the right to vote, but we can prevent you in a number of ways. We can do things like poll taxes, which basically states you have to pay a fee now to vote. If I'm sharecropping or if I'm tenant farming and I'm making maybe $5, $10 a month, if that, and the poll tax is $10, $20, I'm not going to be able to pay that. It is going to cause my family financial hardship for me to give up that $20 just for one time to vote. The way that they get around this, they push the poll taxes applies to everybody, except if your grandfather had the ability to vote, you don't have to pay the poll tax. In fact, if you can't pay the poll tax, you can if you pass this literacy test, you can definitely demonstrate that you can read this document that we give you, you can vote. You have a good number of people who are illiterate in the South, white and Black. So white men who couldn't read, white men who couldn't pay the poll tax were able to take advantage of the grandfather clause, which again, if your grandfather could vote, we will allow you to vote, which is where we get, the term grandfathering something in. It is a way to ensure that you go back to that imbalance of white is one step ahead or one step above, and then Black is back down. We may have Black legislators that are appointed by the Reconstruction governments, but as far as any other voting that's going to take place, you're going to be intimidated. You're going to be harassed. And in the case of a lot of men and some women in the Reconstruction period, and even in the post-Reconstruction period, you would have violence that would take place. And the violence itself is not always physical violence. There's sometimes economic violence. The economic violence would basically work out this way. You're a sharecropper or tenant farmer again. You start talking about voting or you want to vote, the person that owns that land can now kick you off of that land. And by kicking you off of that land, you are now in violation of vagrancy laws because you don't have a job and you don't have a home. You're in violation of vagrancy laws. So now that you have violated that law, we can, under the 13th Amendment, enter into a quasi-slavery system. We can now take you and make you work for someone. Now, are you going to go and try and vote again? If you see this happening to somebody that is a neighbor of yours, that has worked on the same sharecropping plantation or tenant farming system, you see that happening, it is going to now it's going to dissuade you and discourage you from going forth and voting as well. You don't want the trouble. So you saw a lot of people impacted by this in places like Mississippi, Alabama, and Georgia. Like those are the constant three that you see things like this happening. Next slide, please. So the other way that you have a sense of physical violence is through the use of terrorism. And the terrorism itself came in the form of our favorite three-letter organization, the KKK. What they did is all the stuff that I just talked about. They would burn crops, they'd burn down your house, they would lynch you, whether you're white or black. If you're a white person who spoke up for black people, for black suffrage, if you were a white northerner who had come down to run in an election, run for political office, you would be intimidated, you'd be beaten, you'd be shot, sometimes burned alive. And there was really no recourse, because the understanding was, because these men are masked, they're camouflaged, you don't know who is in the clan, which is one of the reasons why they refer to themselves as the Invisible Empire. You don't know who is part of this system. So you may be friends with Mr. Johnson, who has, you know, a couple of acres or a couple of businesses that you frequent, but Mr. Johnson might be in the clan. So you're going to be wary of which white individuals you ally yourself with. So this is a great tactic to divide people who would have otherwise teamed up. Next slide, please. Now, because of the excessive violence that was taken towards black families, as well as white residents and citizens in the South, Congress started to approach how they could deal with the Klan as a terrorist organization. So the executive branch, headed by Ulysses S. Grant, pushed forward with the enforcement acts with Congress, and this labeled, I mean, this is the best way I can put it, they labeled the Klan as a terrorist organization. So there were, I guess, legal means, and I guess sometimes some quasi-legal means, but there were legal means that were used in order to hunt down the Klan. So you had groups like the Union League, you had freedmen groups that would go around who were armed and were given the authority to fight the Klan. You had military units that were in these Reconstruction governments and these Reconstruction zones that would hunt down the Klan as well. The Klan was effectively dead from 1872 until 1915. The reason why the Klan is able to come back in 1915 is due to the fact of that film, Birth of a Nation. It presented a pseudo historical representation of history, and people bought it up. Ate it up, and then started their own chapters. And you had chapters nationwide. You actually had international chapters. There were chapters of the Klan in places like Canada, which oddly enough, you wouldn't think Canada would be involved in something like that, but you had chapters there. The next thing, next slide. The next thing that comes is the Civil Rights Act of 1875. The Civil Rights Act of 1866, I skipped over it, but it was just to expand the protection of rights for people, but it was more of a Band-Aid. The Civil Rights Act of 1875 is set up to specifically address the ways in which local governments and state governments are preventing African Americans from participating in the system. The problem that emerges, unfortunately, next slide, please. Actually, we can skip a few. Go to the election 1876. So in 1876, you have Rutherford B. Hayes running against Samuel Tilden. Hayes is a Republican. Tilden is a Democrat. And when you look at these numbers, Hayes wins by one electoral vote, 185 to 184. The popular vote, he loses by roughly 250,000 people, 250,000 votes. This creates chaos. Now, a lot of us were alive for the 2000 election. And of course, you kind of had a repeat with it with the 2016 election, where you had one candidate who won the popular vote, one candidate who won the electoral vote. one candidate who won the electoral vote, one who won the popular vote. So in both of those elections, as with all elections, the electoral vote is the deciding factor. There is a massive argument, massive fight that takes place. It's a constitutional crisis that takes place because of this election in 1876. So what ends up happening is you run into, you can go to the next slide so I can get those other figures as well. What ends up happening is a backroom deal is made between the Democratic Party and the Republican Party. The Republican Party asks for the Democratic Party to concede the election. The Democratic Party refuses to concede unless one thing is met. And the one thing that they want met is the abandonment of Reconstruction. So even when you look at the way the election works, you've got states all throughout the South, all throughout the Mid-South, the Atlantic, that go for Tilden. Even New York goes for him. But you've got a national party going against a party that is rebuilding its national presence. Because in the 1860 election, the Democratic Party split. You had a Northern Democratic Party and a Southern Democratic Party. It split over the issue of slavery. Now they're rebuilding, and you've got a national party that's emerging, because even in the North, you still had a Democratic Party that was working. It was the Southern Democrats and the Confederate aligned people who were locked out of the political process. So the Democratic Party is able to get the Republican Party to concede, and they abandon, or some people would say, and I would be one of these people to say it, they basically sabotage any growth that you would have had from Reconstruction, because there are a lot of political, economic, and even social gains that are made during that period. Next slide, please. Next slide. So as a result, not only is Reconstruction abandoned, but you have things that were made as part of like the Mississippi Black Codes, and then various local issues to control voting coming back all throughout the South. Without political power, there is nothing that African Americans in the South can really do to fight against any of these measures. So you end up having things like segregation. You have a massive expansion of Jim Crow laws, Jim Crow legislation. And then it's further solidified in the 1892 case of Plessy versus Ferguson, in which Homer Plessy, who was a doctor in New Orleans, aligned with the rail company to basically violate the segregated cars law that they had with the rail line. And the rail line wanted to have integrated cars. They didn't want to have to abide by having black cars and white cars. They lost the case. And as part of that case, the Supreme Court ruled you can have separate facilities as long as they're equal. But then you have to question, what does equality mean? But that gets into another discussion. So 2 more slides. One more. So this is the political makeup that you had in the post-Reconstruction period. You've got 61% of the population Black in South Carolina that are participating. Political participation in Mississippi, despite it being a Black majority state, now it's 17% because of those Black codes. After 1876, you're looking at high teens, low teens, and single digits for almost all these states. Virginia's a little bit higher. But when Reconstruction ends, those voting rights go away. Next slide, please. So with the end of Reconstruction, the question then becomes, what is going to happen to Black people? What does this mean? What does the abandonment of these goals, of these ideals, really mean for African Americans, especially those in the South? The South pushes what's known as home rule. Home rule dictates we are going to determine how our elections look. We're going to determine the qualifications for anybody who is going to register to vote. We're going to determine how we can validate their right to vote. And there's really nothing that can be done about it because there is no voting protection other than the 15th Amendment. If the 15th Amendment, to go back to what the Frederick Douglass quote was stating, if you do not have teeth with this, if you do not enforce it, it's not going to work. You can put whatever you want on paper, but if you're not going to enforce those laws or enforce those constitutional protections, it doesn't matter. Your rights are going to be violated. Next slide, please. So now you have a question of where are Black people going to go? And this is, again, going to the Black question. Limited citizenship, full citizenship. It's basically in limbo because there's not a full clarification as far as what the rights of Black people are, because on paper, the rights exist. 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment are very clear on paper. But as far as in practice and in usefulness, you can be re-enslaved because of the clause within the 13th Amendment. But you also could enter into a quasi-slavery where if you refuse to work for someone, they could make you work for them by citing things like vagrancy or using the law to their benefit. Next slide, please. We don't have any real major legislation until the Civil Rights Act of 1964. The Civil Rights Act of 1964 comes partially in response because of the March on Washington in August of 1963. Now, President Kennedy gave lip service to this, and that might be a little bit unfair to him, but he gave lip service to pushing forward with some type of Civil Rights Act. But unfortunately, because of assassination in November of 1963, we don't know exactly where he would have gone. But his successor, Lyndon B. Johnson, was fully bought into the civil rights movement, fully bought into it politically, as far as he understood the meaning of it, the gravity of it, and understood the necessity of it at that moment. Because being a Texan and being a Southerner, he had dealt with segregationists. His father actually fought against the Klan, at least from what Lyndon Johnson stated about their involvement with that movement going on early on in his life. So he understood the power that these people would have if they were not stopped. So really, the any fighting over the Civil Rights Act came down to what was going to be put in it, what exactly were going to be the protections, and exactly how can we move forward with this. But again, this is just the Civil Rights Act. This is not about voting. So next slide, please. And you had various African-American civil rights leaders stating the same thing, whether it's Fannie Lou Hamer, Dr. King, Malcolm X, Paul Robeson, A. Philip Randolph, Hosea Williams. You had all these Shuttlesworth, you had all these members of this movement saying the same thing: give us the vote. And I talked about how there's this long break between the Civil Rights Act of the 1860s and the Civil Rights Act of the 1960s. And that's partially because the reach is not as much as it is during the post-World War II period. You have two trains of thought, or at least two major thinkers at the end of the 19th century and are emerging in the early 20th century. Unfortunately, Booker T. Washington dies in 1915, but Du Bois continues on until the 60s as far as talking about this issue. And you had two competing ideologies with respect to where we should go with our rights. Should we demand our rights? Should we march? Should we fight? Should we strike out for political power? What should we do? And those two schools of thought, Du Bois on one hand, Booker T on the other, Du Bois said we need to fight for our political rights now. We should not be denied as citizens of the United States our right to vote, our right to political participation. Booker T. Washington's school of thought was, we should not be pressuring this right now. We should be focusing on other things. Focus on vocational education, focus on economic opportunity, building homes, communities, church, that type of thing. Whereas Du Bois is saying we can do all of that, but we can't advance without political power. So you see a major kind of limbo moment from the 1870s until about the 1950s. And that includes this one study that is done by Gunnar Myrdal. He is a Scandinavian sociologist who was hired by the Carnegie Mellon Institute in the 1930s to basically study the South. And his problem, or at least what he calls the American dilemma, is the problem with the American South, as far as why it hasn't developed as much as the Northeast, why it doesn't have industry like the Northeast, why the schools aren't as good as. So he's investigating all these reasons as to why the South has not advanced. And he culminates, or the culminating response or culminating answer to his research is, it comes down to racism. It comes down to that racial hierarchy again, as far as white is on top, black is on bottom. And the fear that black will be equal equates to black must be on top of us. So if black people are equal, that means that they're getting more than we're getting, which means that they're going to be in a superior political, social, and economic position than us. During his interviews and his research in the South, everything that he discovers is linked to that racial paranoia, is linked to that idea of whiteness, the psychological wages of whiteness again, and what that means for Southern white men and women. This idea of equality means we're all going to have a breakdown. So when a film like Birth of a Nation comes out in 1915, Birth of a Nation addresses one of the big fears of white men and white women in the South: miscegenation. In fact, that is a central argument or central fear that's driving much of the dialogue and much of the plot of that film, is this idea of miscegenation. If these black men want to be equal, that means not only do they want to be on top, they now want to take our women. They want to take our political power, our economic power, our social power, and they want to take our women away from us as well, which then means that we are not going to have the population numbers that we had before. The population of white people is going to drop. And we are now all going to be in states like South Carolina, that is a majority black state, or Mississippi up until the Great Migration, a majority black state. And if they are the majority, one person, one vote, we will never have political power again. So by 1964, you've got the Civil Rights Act, but that's not enough. That is not enough. In fact, the civil rights, the March on Washington '63 was about your political rights and jobs. Freedom and jobs were two of the themes that were applied to that. And the way to become free is to be able to participate in the political process. So 1964, you have what's known as Freedom Summer. If you have not, and I implore everyone, if you have not watched Eyes on the Prize or Freedom Rides or any of those programs, you will not get a better firsthand account of what took place unless you are talking to someone directly who had been involved, because the interviews are, for the vast majority, directly from the individuals that were involved, and they have footage from those individuals as far as what was going on. But you had SNCC, which is the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. You had CORE, which is the Congress of Racial Equality. The SCLC, the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, as well as other organizations that moved into the South. They treated this like a military operation. Moved into the South in order to get Black people registered to vote. Unfortunately, because a lot of the students were coming from the Midwest, or they're coming from the Northeast, They were not acquainted with the Southern way of life. And I met one of these individuals who went down, Paul Saltzman, he's Canadian. He came down into Mississippi in the 60s as part of Freedom Summer. The person he ran into when he was looking for his people to communicate with and to organize with, when he was going around asking for certain people, and they asked, where are you from? It's like, oh, I came down from Canada, to help Black people register to vote. Because he was clueless to his admission. He was clueless about what Mississippi was. So he comes down and he asks people, and one individual sees him on the street, asks him this question, like, what are you doing down here? And he said, oh, I'm here to help people register to vote. The guy cold cocks him. When he goes to get the sheriff and says, hey, this guy hit me on the street. You need to arrest him, because he's seeing it as, I'm a Canadian. This is the way the law works. Somebody hits me, they're supposed to be charged with assault. He gets the sheriff. He then takes the sheriff to this young man. The guy, from his description, is sitting on the hood of his truck, smoking a cigarette and drinking a beer. Paul Saltzman, in telling me this story, says, I pointed him out and said, that's the guy who hit me. The sheriff looked at him and says, are you sure that's the guy? Yeah, that's him. That's the guy who punched me. The sheriff then grabs him and says, I don't think that's the guy who did it. So he's basically trying to convince him, you don't want to mess with this guy. In fact, you should probably shut up and go back home. Because the individual who had hit him was Byron de la Beckwith's son. And those of you who aren't familiar with Byron de la Beckwith was a leader of the Klan up until probably the 90s. But he's also the convicted murderer, the person who assassinated Medgar Evers in 1963. So this is just a year after Medgar Evers had been assassinated. Byron de la Beckwith had been put on trial, but it was a hung jury. He wasn't tried again. It was tried again. There were two hung juries, but he was not convicted until the 1990s. And I believe he died in prison a few years ago. But this was the son of one of the most powerful Klansmen in Mississippi. And then Byron de la Beckwith's son went into the Klan as well. So you're seeing what you're having to deal with as a student, as a college student, or as a high school student off for the summer, coming down to Mississippi. And for Mississippians, especially those that were associated with the Klan and the Citizens Council, which are basically the same thing, the members of the Citizens Council and the Klan basically said they can be here during the summer because school starts again in the fall. As long as they're here in the summer, we can outlast them. So you had students that were going around the state. They were living with Black families. They were listening to their grievances. They were talking to them about their needs as human beings and what voting would mean for them. Better school conditions, better roads, better water, better jobs. The same thing that you typically look for in any election year, because the number one driver of any election is almost always economics. It's almost always economics. And then your social needs after that. So your economic needs and your social needs. But as part of this, people like Fannie Lou Hamer, great individuals like Fannie Lou Hamer, understood that going with the political binary was not going to work. The Republican Party was not too sympathetic towards the needs of Black Southerners. The Democratic Party in the South, because the Northern Democratic Party was different. The Democratic Party in the South was not sympathetic to them because you're talking about segregationists. You're talking about people who were affectionately known as Dixiecrats. They were states' rights, segregationists, Jim Crow to the bone. So what Fannie Lou Hamer did, or at least attempted to do in 1964, was to create the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party. So it was a splinter party from the Democratic Party, and she wanted the support of President Johnson. Johnson did something that was very dirty and very underhanded. They gave Fannie Lou Hamer, after some squabbling, they gave Fannie Lou Hamer some time for the press to cover her speech when she talked about lynchings. She talked about the abuse. She talked about forced sterilizations in Mississippi, talked about how bad Mississippi is and how, as a Black woman in Mississippi, political power, political enfranchisement will improve the situation for all Mississippians. Johnson then had called a press conference at the same time that she was speaking in Atlantic City at the Democratic National Convention. So he goes and talks about, I think it was like who he's going to appoint for a federal circuit judge or something, but they don't allow her that access. So even beyond voting, there are other ways that people's political access is controlled and constrained. Next slide, please. So beyond just the Democratic Party, or at least Democratic Party leadership, trying to silence people like Fannie Lou Hamer while they're outside of Mississippi, you have violence that's taking place in Mississippi. So you have arrests when people are marching. You have bombing of people's homes and churches. But probably the most well-known example of what took place was the lynching of Goodman, Cheney, and Schwerner. Goodman, Cheney, and Schwerner, and in fact, James Cheney was from Meridian, Mississippi, but Andrew Goodman and Michael Schwerner were from outside of Mississippi. And they came down as SNCC volunteers, as Corps volunteers, to get people registered to vote. The sheriffs and Klansmen were handing out pictures of Michael Schwerner, and they affectionately referred to him as Goatee. They gave him that code name because Michael Schwerner wore a goatee. They stopped these men as they were driving from one meeting to another meeting, pulled them off to the side of the road, and then put them in the back of the police car, drove them off somewhere else, and then brutally tortured and murdered all three of the men. The coroner, the medical examiner, when they examined James Cheney's body, said it looked like he had been in a plane crash. That's how disfigured and that's how broken his body was. They were found in either in a quarry or a dam, but their bodies were dumped there with the idea that they wouldn't be found. There's some good news that cover it. Mississippi Burning has it as kind of a background story, but there's a lot of fiction that goes into that one. Next slide, please. All right. So the Voting Rights Act passes in 1965, but the problem is now you've got to deal with things like gerrymandering. You've got to deal with the way things are going to be registered. You've got to deal with the way in which all this is. Actually, I'm getting ahead of myself. I'm sorry. I'm not even looking at the slides now. But the push is, what are we going to do to obtain full protections of individuals beyond race? How are we going to ensure that we have people that their voting rights are protected? Because in places like Alabama, and I'll pick on Alabama because we got the Selma March I'm going to talk about briefly. In places like Alabama, they went beyond a literacy test. They went beyond poll taxes. They went beyond just closing the offices. They would have the offices open very few times during the week, if during the month, in majority Black areas. So if you went to go register to vote, you would have to go at like a 1 o'clock on a Thursday. And if you didn't get there at 1 o'clock on Thursday, you could not register to vote. And just registering does not mean that you are allowed to vote. So there are a number of cases in which individuals would go in for that 1 o'clock Thursday meeting to meet with the registrar. And the registrar would ask them to tell them, what amendment to the Constitution is this? What amendment to the Constitution is this? And if they pass, they would then give them an impossible number, an impossible question. Oh, how many circuit court judges do we have in the state? And if you got the number right, they would then ask you, name all of them. So they gave you an impossible task, but they found the loopholes that they could use in order to prevent people from voting. And the one thing I will say, which I'm going to say again toward the end, if voting were not that important, people would not be working so hard to prevent you from voting. So, next slide, please. So, in excuse me, in the spring of '65, a voting rights march was planned. It was going to go from Selma, Alabama, to Montgomery, Alabama. Montgomery, the capital of Alabama. And I'm also going to ruin a song for some of you. So some of you who might know of the song Sweet Home Alabama, the song Sweet Home Alabama is a direct response to a song from Neil Young that is talking about the abuses that Alabama has committed against African Americans. So Leonard Skinner, who wrote and performed the song is directly praising the segregationist Jim Crow system of Alabama. Because one of those lines, in Birmingham, we love the governor. The governor at the time was George Wallace, and Birmingham, it was in response to the actions that took place in 1963 and 1964, in which African Americans were trying to get voting rights and voting access, and of course, alluding to the bus boycotts earlier, roughly about a decade earlier from when the March at Selma takes place. But at the Edmund Pettus Bridge, which you can see in the upper right corner over this trooper's shoulder, that is the moment in which millions of people around the world were aghast, because John Lewis, I think I said before we recorded, one of the greatest Americans is Frederick Douglass. And I'm not going to skip a beat and say that John Lewis is one of the greatest Americans that this nation has ever had. One of the greatest people this planet has ever had. Because as a young man, I believe he was 19 at the time. As a young man, he led this march because organizers of the march did not want to go through with it because of some threats that had taken place. John Lewis and roughly about 1,500 other marchers were not going to be stopped. They did not have permission to march on the roads. So they marched on the sidewalk. So they marched on the sidewalk that's up here, as you can see on of course, obviously on the sides of that bridge. And as they crossed that bridge, the troopers were waiting for them, as well as the press. The press, when they saw what took place, did not miss a thing. You had national and international press that was covering this event. And when people around the world saw this, it was a national embarrassment. John Lewis, as well as several other marchers, were severely injured. He had his skull cracked open. You had a lot of people who suffered concussions, breathing issues, because tear gas was used against them. Because the sheriff, as well as the leader of the state troopers, when these men and women crossed, told them they had, I forgot what the time limit was that they gave them, but it was a false time limit that they gave, which was, you need to disperse now. On the count of 3, they say 1, and they start firing the tear gas at you. So there was no moment in which these men and women were set up to, we can peacefully and without a conflict leave this site. The press that was there, again, national and international press that was there to see this event, covered it in images and video as well as audio. You had press in Europe, Asia, Latin America, that all were asking the question of what is going on in America. And as a result of this, you could not stop the momentum, because now people are seeing these people are being beaten up because they want to vote. These people are not raiding the town. They're not, they're not running through with weapons and committing terrorist acts. They simply want to vote. And again, I will say this: voting, if voting were not important, people would not be working so hard for you not to be able to vote. They would not be working so hard to stop you from voting. Next slide, please. So here we are. You're looking at the after effects of this. So the Voting Rights Act protects your right to vote, gets rid of poll taxes, gets rid of voting tests, literacy tests, or any of these other voter registration tests that they would have. It is set up to standardize the protections for people when it comes to their voting rights. So pre-Civil Rights Act and Voting Rights Act. So 1960 voting registration compared to 71, it's basically flipped. Majority unregistered in 1960, majority registered in 1971. Next slide, please. All right. So the way this works out, you're talking about 64. There is a reason why this kind of or starts at 65, because again, we're looking at the way it works post Civil Rights Act and post Voting Rights Act. So 64, 65. Now you're looking at a constant of roughly about 60%, roughly 60% for the presidential election. And then it hits its peak again because you start seeing this movement going up and down. You got this nice little roller coaster. But then you have this steady incline, the steady increase from 96 all the way to 2012. 92, people attribute Clinton to voting. For that spike. It drops in 96, as you would typically see with an incumbent president. But then you see it jump right around here in 2008. And since we can't have a dialogue right now, it's very clear as to why you have this jump in 2008. And that is with the election of Barack Obama. And then it goes up again in 2012. So you see this steady incline with Black voting with respect to presidential elections. And you see an incline with midterm elections. Now, mind you, midterms, you will often have that argument of, I don't have someone to vote for. So you would see, within local elections, within state elections, or at least national offices, as far as your representatives or your senators, you might be dissuaded from voting because of the stranglehold. If you're in South Carolina, you might be, because the stranglehold that somebody like Jesse Helms has in North Carolina, the stranglehold that somebody like Strom Thurmond has in South Carolina, that would dissuade people. But the presidential elections are going to get people to show up. There's only one time that it drops below 50%, and that's the election with Carter. Barely ever even gets close to 50%. With midterms, the average would come out to around 40, but you're not seeing anything comparable to presidential elections. Next slide, please. All right. Now, when we're looking at Black voters within the South, you're now seeing an increase where Southern Black voters are outpacing national voting. Next slide, please. And this is even important. Oh, I'm sorry. Let me go back a couple of slides. Let me go back one more. I left out something. I did not mean to leave it out. The other way in which you're looking at controls on voting, because you don't have just poll taxes, the literacy test, things like that anymore, or even people preventing you from voting. What you have in a time like 1968, starting over here on the left, 64 is the election of Johnson because he succeeds President Kennedy after his assassination. He gets elected officially as president. He declines to run in 68. And you have Nixon in the election of 68 that adopts something that has become known as the Southern strategy. The Southern strategy And you can even almost go back to the 1860s to see how this works for him. The Southern strategy is all about taking advantage of the animosity, the anxiety of white men in the South, primarily white men in the South, and in some cases, taking advantage of the fears of white women in the South in order to get them to become your base. So you don't lose the South if you're Republican, if you're conservative. You will gain the South by adhering to dog whistle politics, pointing out things, talking about things like the welfare queen, or talking about affirmative action. So you see, in 68, the Southern strategy gets adopted. It gets reinforced in 72. 76, you've got Ford versus Carter. But then Reagan comes back in 1980 and goes off on this. So you got Reagan, Bush, and then you got the election of Clinton. You got the election of George W. Bush in 2000 and 2004. And I would not hesitate to state that former President Trump took advantage of the Southern strategy in order to win the election in 2016, and then took advantage of it in 2020. But there was enough backlash against him where the Southern strategy was not going to work as well. All right. Let's get to that last slide if we can. I'm sorry, the second to last slide. There we go. So in the 2016 and 2018 elections, you can see how Black voter turnout has helped out with respect to determining what states are going to be swing states. So if you look at Ohio, Georgia, even a smaller state like smaller population state like Arizona or Iowa, you can see how these groups, Black voters themselves, can be the determining factor in these elections. Because as we saw in the midterm election of 2022 or in the presidential election of 2020, the talking point becomes, what's going to win over Black voters? Because for the most part, Black voters have been primarily and predominantly Democratic, part of the Democratic base. Black Republicans, on the other hand, have just gotten to double digits in the 2018 election, 2018 midterms. I didn't see the figures for 2020, but I would say they wouldn't be too far off. It would probably still be around 8 to 10%, maybe 11%, depending on where you are, depending on the figures. All right, next slide, please. Now, this last graph that I've got for you shows the way voting breaks down based off of age for African Americans. So this dark blue line, almost looks black, is 18 to 24. And then you compare that with the oldest group, which is the 65 plus. 65 plus, you're looking at a group comparably, 64 and 68. This group, 18 to 24, this is the first time they're eligible to vote legally, because you're able to vote at 21 and it changes under Nixon to 18. But even during that time, it drops. And this is partially due to social and economic despair, as far as I don't see a reason to vote. But you see the exact opposite with that group of 65 plus. Not to mention the group of 45 to 64-year-olds are consistently between 60 and 70%. So roughly about 65, 66% average. But the 65 plus group, this is their first opportunity to vote legally and have their votes protected. They are on a steady incline, and now they've overtaken the 45 to 64 age group. The average itself is right here on this, where am I? On the blue line. So Black voter turnout is always around 50 to 60%, sometimes higher, sometimes lower. The key is trying to figure out how you can get that remaining 35% to turn out. Now, this other stuff I'm going to talk about is not on the on the PowerPoint, so you can just put me back on the camera on the feed. You can end this if you would, please. All right. So again, I'm going to say this probably like 5 more times. If it did not matter, if your vote did not matter, people would not be trying so hard to prevent you from voting. And we're talking about gerrymandering, redrawing districts in between election years, not notifying predominantly Black areas or predominantly Black voter groups, or districts that would lean towards the patterns of minoritized and marginalized groups. They would not do that if it weren't beneficial. Now, the other thing that we have to consider is this: the nullification of the Voting Rights Act by John Roberts, or at least the John Roberts Court of the Supreme Court, wherein I believe in 2012, might have been, 2012, they ruled that the Voting Rights Act didn't need to be enforced because we had ascended to a point where, I'm not sure how he came to this conclusion, but Chief Justice John Roberts stated that we've come to this point where it doesn't need to be enforced because we've reached a moment of racial equality. If you talk to people in rural Alabama, if you talk to people anywhere in the Black Belt, whether we're talking about West Georgia, Southern Georgia, all throughout Alabama, all throughout Mississippi, they will tell you that is wrong. When you have the state government that shuts down places where they can vote, register to vote, to get the IDs that the state government is requiring them to use in order to vote, that is voter suppression. And you're seeing voter suppression in many different shapes, many different ways, in many different states. And it is all geared to ensuring that we can nullify the votes of Black individuals, to not even stop them from voting, but if we discourage you from voting, that is just as effective as taking your vote away. Because if you don't show up, my vote counts 1, your vote counts 0. And that's the way that it's going to be treated. I don't have to physically stop you from showing up to the polls. If I simply discourage you by, this was your polling location in 2020, and I go to my same polling location in 2022, and they simply tell me, no, you're not registered here, you're in another district, and they put it in a place that's hard to find, which we found out in the 2020 and 2022 election. You had places in Florida that actually did this, and actually a couple of places in Georgia that moved a polling location for predominantly Black and brown neighborhoods, Black and brown voters, to another area to where they weren't acquainted with what that was. They didn't know that they had moved. And since you're talking about a day in which you have to take off from work, a day in which you have to allot, in the case of Georgia, 6, 7, 8. And I saw some people saying they were in line for 12 hours, that long to get people to vote. You do things like that, you don't have to write into the law that Black people can't vote, brown people can't vote, indigenous people can't vote. You just simply make it a chore. You make it difficult for them to vote to dissuade them from showing up the next time. That way you control political power. For the Black community, the issues that are always at the forefront are simply the same as they were during the Freedmen period: education, jobs, economic opportunity, and resources. Those are the constants that are there. And as a result of being locked out of the political process in many ways and in many cases, you end up having cities, you have neighborhoods, you have parts of states that are cut off from the basic resources. You don't have to look any further than Jackson, Mississippi, or Flint, Michigan, to see how these communities are treated when they are politically disenfranchised. What incentive is there for me as a legislator to give resources to this group if you're not going to vote? And therein lies the problem. If I convince you not to vote, if I discourage you from voting, you do not matter. I'm still at 1, you're still at 0. And then you get treated that way. Thank you.
Thank you. That was I'm going to say powerful presentation. I'm feeling very different emotions after listening to that. But just the power of that is certainly undeniable, and just hearing some of this history is it's hard history to hear, but it's also very important as
Mhm.
we look at the future of American democracy and so many other things. So thank you for that.
No,
Let's
thank you.
dive in. Thanks. Let's dive into, and we have a lot of audience questions and some questions that came up from your presentation.
Okay.
The first one I want to hit on is actually towards the end, as you were talking about the gap, that 35% that's not accounted for in those who would be able to vote who are not coming out. The question was asked: Is that 35% imprisoned?
No, no,
Is
this
that
was
where
30%,
that's coming
35% of eligible voters. Of eligible vote. Now, some of those would be, I mean, but 35% is not, we don't have 30%, 35% of our population there. I think to assist people with that, because that was an issue I thought about when I was putting this together, was that's another way that you have political disenfranchisement. So to pick on Nixon, because I have no problem picking on Nixon and picking on Reagan, to pick on Nixon pushed forward with the war on drugs as a way to further marginalize the black community and also marginalize liberal communities, liberal white communities. And then of course Reagan pushed even farther with the war on drugs with um, disproportionate sentencing. So you've got powder cocaine versus rock cocaine. So powder cocaine, you get, just as an example, you would get anywhere from 10 to 100 times, excuse me, 100. You would get 10 times the sentence that you would if you were carrying the same amount of powder cocaine because of who it's associated with. So as a result, you got those felony charges. You served that time as a felon. You are now locked out of the political system. You're not allowed to vote. You have some states that have pushed forward with restorative justice, restorative rights, and ensuring that you did your time. We're going to get you your ability to vote back. I think Florida had a program, or still has a program now, that is about restoring people's voting rights. And unfortunately, there was one individual, one woman I know, who had gone through it and was even informed that she had the right to vote, voted, and now they got her on charges of voter fraud for illegally voting in the Florida election. I believe it was in 2018 or 2020 that they brought the charges up against her. But again, she was a former felon, served her time, went through all the proper steps to get reinstated, get her voting rights reinstated. But I think it's also got to think about the best. It's just being discouraged. If you are in a system, if you're in a situation where you're not seeing any change, and you're not seeing any change from the people that are meant to help you, you're not going to show up to the polls to vote, because you would hear the same thing over and over again, like, oh, we're going to put money in the schools, we're going to do this, you're going to do this. But if you see that after a period of time that has not taken place, you're not going to vote. But again, then it turns into a thing of somebody is not invested in you, into your community, into your wants, or for that matter, they're not interested in your needs, because they do not see you as somebody who's going to vote for them. Unfortunately, I've been in those rooms where I've heard legislators say, "I'm not getting their votes anyway," and it's shocking for someone to say that those aren't my, they are your constituents. They might not be your voters, but they are your constituents. So you know what? You still need to take care of them. You're still responsible for them. But yeah, I think a lot of it comes down to discouragement. But you also have the issue of voter education, where several states have I guess almost thrown in the towel with respect to civics education. So there are a lot of people don't even know where they can go to register to vote. When I was in high school, I was fortunate enough that I went to a high school where they made us register to vote before we graduated.
Mhm.
And maybe it comes down to community organizations partnering with schools to get new graduates, or at least people who are going to be graduating, turning 18, going in and talking to them about it. Just having a quick chat about these are the ways that you can vote. I'm sorry, these are the ways that you can register to vote, and going over the basics of it. Because in all honesty, if you don't know what it is, it's very intimidating. But in all honesty, it's a very quick process. In Arizona, when I was living there, which you can attest to this now, uh, you register to vote when you get your driver's license. Because when I moved there, I just simply went register to vote, just click the button online, and I was done. And some states are not that accommodating, and they will definitely make you jump through hoops. I mean, it just depends on the state, because we do not have a national standard when it comes to voting. We don't have a national standard when it comes to voter registration, as far as like how it's going to be implemented, the places in which it's going to be done, and even the discussion about voter IDs, which would go against the 15th Amendment, because if you're requiring someone to pay for something in order to vote, that is a violation of the 15th Amendment. Even if it is a driver's license, if you're saying I have to have a driver's license to vote, I'm paying for the driver's license, and you're saying the only way I can vote is if I have a driver's license, you have now given me a backdoor poll tax, or at least charged me with backdoor poll tax, as opposed to if the government or if someone were proposed some legislation that stated we will give from taxpayer funded voter IDs to anybody who wants them. We will set up appointments. We'll have a truck that'll come by. You go to CVS or Walgreens or whatever Quick Mart that you go to, and we'll have somebody there in the parking lot to do it. I think once it's made easier for people to access the electoral system, those numbers are going to go up. But I mean, in all honesty, those are the numbers for pretty much every group. I think Asian Americans were higher, but roughly nationwide, Black voter turnout is not that far off from white voter turnout. To go back to that long arc going from the 1860s to now, it's not that far off from white voter turnout. Now it differs during midterms, but as far as overall, it's roughly the same. It's within a few points. It's not that far off. The biggest difference is within age, as far as if you're young, you're less likely to vote. If you're older, you know what stake you have in the game.
Okay. One of the questions that kept coming up for me as you were talking through the 15th Amendment and 13th Amendment, and we're looking at these different laws that determine who is eligible to vote, who's not. One question was asked early in the presentation. Is it true that the United States is one of only a few countries that do not allow those in prison to vote?
Some states, I think Vermont allows, but we don't have a national system to dictate who can and who can't. Yeah, we have European nations. There are several. Norway, I mean, it's really the Scandinavian countries themselves. I can't speak for Britain because I've never looked at it. I've seen the ones that definitely do. Scandinavian countries, like the candidates will even come to the prisons to ask their constituents. They will ask these men and women, what is it we can do to help you when you get out? Because that's another thing that you're looking at, because when you talk about prison, or at least the prison industrial complex that we have set up in the United States, it's set up to where we're not going to facilitate a way for you to stay out. And I think by involving the political system in this, where it's, candidate A and candidate B have to go and meet their constituents wherever they are, or they happen to go to a federal prison or a state prison or wherever, and actually talk to these men and women about what their needs are, they're going to tell you it's simple: job training. I would not have been out here, running the streets if I had a job, if I had stable housing, if if I had resources, if you have people who are in jail for simple things like drug usage and drug possession, as opposed to putting them in prison, maybe get them into treatment programs, maybe get them some help as opposed to warehousing them. But yeah, we're one of the few countries that does not allow nationally does not allow prisoners to vote and participate. I'd have to ask my wife about Mexico because I can't remember if they could or not. I think Canada they can.
One of the things that I'm struggling with or trying to reconcile, I think, in my head is, as you were talking about the 15th Amendment saying that the vote or the right to vote would not be denied based on I don't remember if it said a prior state of servitude or just that state in general. And then we look at the 13th Amendment, which allows servitude or slavery through the jail system. And then we look at the laws that allow us to deny the vote to those who are experiencing a state of servitude through the jail system. Like, how do we reconcile those things together and not say that they are contradictory or just entering into this kind of loop or this cycle of disenfranchisement?
All right, I'm going to sound a little radical here, so I'm going to say this. Constitution needs a page one rewrite. The Constitution needs a page one rewrite because the circumstances that we have in 2023 do not match the circumstances that we have in 1789. This is again, it's a situation where we need to actually update and revisit a good amount of the legislation, and not look at it as, well, these people went to prison and they're bad and they did what. We don't know what the circumstances were. Yes, some people were really bad and they ended up going to prison. But then some people, it was just an unfortunate set of circumstances. I myself, I could easily have been swapped with any of the people that are in any institution in this country, just based off of having a bad day or a wrong interaction with somebody, or I made the wrong choice. But that is not a thing of permanence. But the other thing is, if you're looking at something like the 13th Amendment, that caveat of servitude based off conviction of a crime, or involuntary servitude based on conviction of a crime, that is one of those things that was almost a compromise, because it allowed the southern states to get away with what they were able to get away with, and that was quasi-slavery. It wasn't chattel slavery, but it is a new way of ensuring that you have a workforce. In fact, you have state governments. Arkansas, I think they got rid of it, but you have state governments that use prison labor for basic functions, and sometimes for public safety. In California, you have prisoners that are put out into the wilderness to fight fires, but when they get out, they can't become a firefighter. Mm-hmm. So it becomes a thing. Like, we need to revisit exactly what the purpose of incarceration is, but then couple that with political power. And the best way we can do this is informing people about their rights, informing people about what their purpose, not what their purpose is, what exactly they can gain as part of this system, and what they can actually provide as part of this system. And understanding that your vote, again, I'm a broken record at this point. If your vote were not important, you would not have people working so hard to get rid of it, or getting rid of your right to have a vote.
I want to go back to some of the early questions from earlier in your presentation. So one of the questions was, how is it that these switch their views over time?
How's the parties?
Yes, I believe Democrat and Republican parties.
Ooh, we're getting into my fun stuff now. All right, so you're looking at the Republican Party in 1860. The Republican Party itself is a national party. All right, it emerges as a national party during Reconstruction. The Democratic Party, as I said, was a splintered party or broken party in 1860 because They disagreed. The Southern wing disagreed with the Northern wing disagreed with the Southern wing over what role slavery was going to have going forward. So you got a conservative party with respect to the overall Democratic National Party in the 1860s through the 1930s. The switch really happens because people like to say the 1960s was a switch. The switch really happens in the 1930s because you have Republicans that are in office in the 1920s. You have Warren G. Harding, you have Herbert Hoover that are in the 1920s. You see the economic collapse that takes place when Franklin D. Roosevelt comes in. He is a New Yorker, but he is commanding a national party. The Southern wing is still conservative. The Northern wing is fairly liberal. The Republican Party is becoming more conservative in the 1920s. They're very anti-immigrant. I mean, the immigration acts that the Republicans are passing, I mean, it's basically, in the South, you had water fountains and doors that would say whites only. The Republican immigration policy was basically the same thing. At the Immigration Act of 1919, 1924, it was basically whites only. So they started becoming more conservative in the 20s, and they stay conservative, I guess moderate and conservative, depending on who's the president, throughout that time, and they get more conservative as they go. In fact, Dr. King, in one of his interviews in the 1960s, was asked about the future of the Republican Party. I think it was 64 when he was asked, maybe 65. He was asked about the Republican Party, and it was, oh my gosh, not Tom Brokaw. Oh my gosh, I can't believe I forgot his name. Anyway, he used to be on CBS News. But he asked him the question, and he said, well, is there a true fear that the Republican Party is going to be a whites only party or a white man's party? And Dr. King said everything that they're passing or pushing with their legislation, the absorption of the Dixiecrats, that is doing nothing more than establishing them as a whites only party that is going to be focused on white issues, white needs, not focus on anybody else in the country. You're going to focus on those things. And his prediction came out to be true because you started seeing, again, 68, you had the Southern strategy, you had Reagan in 1980. I mean, you had the war on drugs that starts in the 70s. You have Reagan coming in 1980 and accepts the nomination of the presidency in Philadelphia, Mississippi. And I had it on the slide. Philadelphia, Mississippi is the site of the torture and assassination of Cheney, Goodman, and Schwerner. Philadelphia, Mississippi was a hotbed of Klan action. So again, he goes in hard with the racial dog whistles, and some people would even say train whistles. But the switch takes place fully, or the switch is completed in the 1960s. It starts in the 30s with Roosevelt, and he's expanding social programs. He wants to have the minimum wage. And the people that are making the complaint against the minimum wage are doing so because they do not want to ensure that you have full employment of African Americans or equal pay for African Americans. He wants to ensure that we have it across the board, straight across the board, jobs for everybody, fair wages for everybody, fair working conditions. But you had Southern legislators, Southern Democrats, who would not sign off any legislation. So any jobs programs that were going to help Black people, they wanted to have 100% white employment before any money went towards Black programs or anything that would help Black citizens. So the switch starts where the Republicans start becoming more conservative in the beginning of the 20th century. They become really conservative in the 70s and the 80s. Which now the Republican Party that you see with everything that you see on television, the conservative movement that they have is completely different, or excuse me, it's completely further to the right than where we were in the 1980s under Reagan, where we thought that was the pinnacle of the conservative movement and the conservative revolution that took place to get him elected, pushing social programs, or at least culture war ideas, things about abortion, affirmative action, cutting aid to U.S. citizens, cutting Social Security, things like that. But long answer. So the switch starts in the 1920s and 30s, and is completed in the 1960s under Nixon.
One of the other questions was, when did the voting age drop from 21 to 18?
That was changed under Nixon's administration, and let me pull up the date real quick, because I remember it wasn't too controversial, because it piggybacked off of the Vietnam War, and the argument was these men can be, they can go off to fight at 18, but they can't vote. So it was 1971, 26th Amendment. So it was under his first administration, and it was piggybacking off of the idea of the Vietnam War. These young men are going off to fight. They can fight at 18, they can vote. And this is also when you start seeing alcohol laws change as well, which again, it's one of those things like Louisiana was a holdout when it came to the same age issue, where they kept their drinking age at 18 for the longest time until the federal government said, we're not paying for your roads. And I remember as a kid driving through Louisiana, and those roads were horrible.
One of the other audience questions really digs into something that I was going to ask. The question was, why does it seem that it always comes back to the blacks will enslave us like we did them, and just that fear that gets put behind the black vote. And one of the things that stood out to me in what you talked about was the fear of black voters outnumbering white voters, outpacing the political power of white voters. And it sounds like a potential origin of the replacement theory that we're seeing coming back into prevalence and popularity now. So it is a question of, why do we keep going back to that same fear tactic? And what does it say about both the state of American politics and the state of the black vote that this theory is cycling back into popularity?
Well, I would say what's old is new again. So that replacement theory itself is just another version of just racial paranoia. I mean, that's the only way I can put it. Peggy Pasco wrote a book. I think she passed away like 10, 12 years ago. I was looking for it on my shelf because I will never hesitate to recommend it. It's called What Comes Naturally. And it talks about interracial relations and miscegenation from before the founding of the nation. So from the colonial period. This is something that started in the 17th century, to the point where you had laws that were written well before the United States became a country that stated that black men and white women cannot intermingle, because now we're defining what whiteness is. And if we do that, and if this black male and this white female were to have children, that child is now non-white, which now means the number of non-white people is going to surpass white people. So if that happens, what ends up happening for us is we now become the minority with respect to numbers. With places like South Carolina, there was such a fear of slave revolt because you had 61% was black, 29% of the state was white. At one point, I think at one point it was like 66% black, but roughly 2/3 of the state is black, 1/3 is white at any given time during the 19th century. There was such racial paranoia that the state passed a law that if you were a white male, you could be you could go to jail if you did not have your gun or your rifle with you on a Sunday. So you would have These men that were traveling to church, they would have to check in their guns at church. And because Sunday was typically the day that if you were an enslaved person and if you were a good slaveholder, you gave your slaves the day off on Sunday to go worship. The fear was that's the only time the slaves would congregate by themselves, or the odds of them being supervised were lower. The fear was because there's so many of them. One, I mean, they can't vote, so we're not worried about their political power, but there's so many of them, they can overpower us and just take over this entire state. And that's kind of where we've been the entire time. It's always this fear of numbers and this identity that's associated with race and ethnicity and your background. And if I don't have X amount of people that look like me, and this group is increasing, they're going to use the power that I've been using against them. They're going to now use it against me, and we can't do that. The state of Arizona, to bring it back home, the state of Arizona the territory of Arizona took so long to become a state because it was not a majority white state. Up until 1910, from 1862 until 1910, the highest percentage was 48% white. The 52% was indigenous, Mexican American, and black. And and Asian as well, because there were 800 Asian people in the state in 1900. So that's what you had to go with. 48% was white. The other 52% was regarded as non-white. And what some people did with the census, they tried to record some of the Mexican Americans as white, just to play with the census figures to get those numbers up. But they were not allowed to become a state by Congress. They could not file for statehood until they had a majority majority white population in the state. And it always comes down to that. I mean, the United States' biggest flaw is that the system of white supremacy, or systems of white supremacy, have been woven right into the fabric of the country, to where we often can't have these discussions where we analyze and think about things like citizenship. It wasn't until 1924 that indigenous people had citizenship in this country. Black people didn't have citizenship in this country until the 15th Amendment, really the 14th Amendment, but really the 15th Amendment, because if you're not allowed to vote, what is your citizenship? And if we really want to think about it, there was not full citizenship for Black people until the Voting Rights Act in 1965. Because if your voting rights are not protected and you cannot fully participate in the political system, you effectively don't have citizenship. It doesn't matter if I say I was born in this land. If I have no political power, I have no authority to determine the future of the country, future of this area, that my birth certificate is just a piece of paper. It doesn't define the citizenship.
Wow.
I didn't mean to bring it down.
I mean, it's so important, and it's heavy stuff to think about, but it's also just really, really important conversations for us to have as we think about where we're heading as a nation. So I'll end with one last question, and maybe this will help bring us back up a little bit, is just to ask, what would you say to that younger demographic who represents that bottom line on the last chart that you showed, in terms of encouraging them to see the social awareness and the importance and the power of their vote when it comes to shifting these political landscapes and just the narrative of the nation?
Oh, that's the easiest question. I'm sorry, that's the easiest answer to this question. This takes us back to the numbers. So I'm going to start off with my broken record statement. If your vote did not matter, you would not have people actively trying to take away your right to vote. 18 to 24-year-olds. I mean, we can't look at it as, hey, this is something that these people, because I was showing my daughter the Eyes on the Prize, and we were having some conversations based off of what we were seeing. And she got turned off, not on the subject matter, because she's seeing the fire hoses, she's seeing the dogs, and she's like, why are they doing that? That doesn't, why? I said, because they're scared of these people having political power. They're scared of these people getting rights. They're doing this. And she's like, just basically pointing out, like, Daddy, that's what bad people are. And so she was seeing all these people and saying, and I'd say, like, no, those are racist people. I said, let's not put all the group of this people in together. These are racist people that do not want anything different than the worldview that they see. But when she looked at it, she was kind of like, but this just seems so long ago. And then I had to process it. What do you mean? She's like, it's in black and white. And then again, I'm thinking, like, that's how I thought when I was seeing these same things. And I was closer to that time period when I saw these images. And I had to remind her, I'm like, color film existed at that time. They just showed this stuff in black and white because it was cheaper, it was more affordable, and people did not have color TVs the same way that basically everybody has a flat screen TV now. And what I think her problem is, I shouldn't say a problem, her disconnect is the same disconnect that a good number of people in that Zoomer category, that Gen Z group, is. They see some of these images as so long ago that we've all gotten so used to. I mean, for the most part, those of us who are privileged enough to, I can just go down to City Hall, or I can go to the DMV and register to vote, or I can just go online and vote. We've gotten so privileged with it, we haven't seen all those things that people have fought for. So by using the narrative of, like, hey, your ancestors fought for this, your grandparents fought for this, people died for these rights, that's not something that's not going to necessarily work, because that's not present in their lives. Mm-hmm. I think what it comes down to is seeing those numbers, because I pulled it back up on my other screen here. 2020 voter turnout for 18 to 24 year olds was 44%. You're looking at, you could double those numbers easily. The Zoomers, as far as that Gen Z, which was in that category of that 18 to 24, there are more of them than there are baby boomers. So what I would say to them, to answer your question, if you are tired of what the baby boomer generation has done or not done, there are more of you than there are of them. Start pushing for things, supporting legislation, legislators, elected officials that mirror the worldview that you think we should have based off of what we've already had. What is missing? What are some things that you need? And I saw a great, it was in a meme form, but I saw a great breakdown of a discussion, and it was universal basic income versus universal basic needs. Universal basic income just gives you the money, and it gives the money back to those same people that are going to be controlling, pharmaceuticals or merchandise, things like that. But if you have universal basic needs, as far as your healthcare, housing, things like that, that is already taken care of. You go work, get whatever you're going to make, and then you add that money to the economy. And so you have a lot of people within that age group that are having that discussion over universal basic income versus universal basic needs, going away from fossil fuels, pulling, not getting involved internationally in different issues, but focusing on, we need to take care of schools, we need to have healthcare, we need to have this, and this. And I think the strongest thing that they have at their availability or their access is social media. Mm-hmm. Whereas civil rights leaders were able to make use of media, as far as the news agencies, print media, television media, radio media, in their time period, because that was what they had to get the message across. You now have people within this age group, 18 to 24, 18 to 30, and even the ones that are going to be 18 soon and voting age, they have a platform, or at least have people, or have access to people with a large enough platform where they can talk about these issues. And I've seen it take place where you got somebody who has 100,000 followers, or they have 5,000 followers on TikTok or whatever, and they talk about politics, or they talk about a ballot measure, or they talk about these different things that are coming up that normally we don't see talked about on the news. And their age group is not watching Good Morning America. They're not watching CNN. They're not watching Fox. They're going to be getting their news from Twitter, from TikTok, and that's it. So they're getting a lot of information that way and disseminating that information and even fact checking the information. So they're not accepting things as fact unless it can be backed up by other data, other information. So I would say first and foremost, there's more of you than there are of boomers, and even my generation, the greatest generation of all time, Gen X. Uh, there's more of them than there are of the other generations. So if they want something to happen, they have the power to make it happen.
Well, thank you so much for this presentation, this discussion. This was heavy, it was important, and it's, I think, and I hope that folks that see this will take it as a call to action. I was thinking as you were presenting and as we were having the conversation about, we're just on the back end of celebrating Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Day, and seeing so many of those calls to, let's do more than quote him this year. Right. Let's actually engage in some action and doing the things that he truly stood for, and to risk falling back into that quote camp. Right. The one that came to mind as you were speaking, and as I think I and the audience are probably going through the wide range of emotions that some of what you spoke about brought up, is this quote where he says, "It is purposeless to tell Negroes they should not be enraged when they should be. Indeed, they would be mentally healthier if they do not suppress rage, but vent it constructively and use its energy peacefully, but forcefully, to cripple the operations of an oppressive society." And just thinking about that as we're talking about the importance of the vote, if there is nothing else that gets us out to the polls and gets us speaking, it should be our frustration, our anger, our not bitterness, but just that healthy state of being enraged at the oppressive society that we are working against. Thank you.
Thank you
for sharing with us this evening. And we hope to have you back again soon.
Oh, you will. You can't get rid of me.
Good. And thank you to our audience who joined us tonight. We had a lot of really great questions coming through. I'm so glad to see that we still have folks that are tuning in. And I encourage anyone that was watching tonight to share this with your network and remind them that this series is ongoing. We're going to continue having these conversations and encouraging that level of civic and civil engagement into 2023. So thank you for joining us tonight. And as always, go in grace.